Well, if you thought 2024 was going to be easier on the household budget, think again. The cost of your weekly shop, which already requires a second mortgage, is about to get even more expensive thanks to the government. The Nationals are warning that changes to the Pacific Island Farm Worker Scheme will push food prices even higher. Joining me now is Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, thanks for your time. This scheme allows farmers to hire workers from Pacific Island countries for up to 4 years when there are local worker shortages. So that makes sense, but what changes is the government proposing to the scheme that's going to affect grocery prices?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. What they've done is taken away what we call the averaging provisions, and what that allowed to do was to average out because of the weather. And unfortunately, what happens is it rains. You can't send workers out to pick into the paddock to get that product out of a paddock and onto your plate. So what we had in place was over the 9 months of each year that they were here for the 4 years, you could average out the days that they were sitting on the couch and couldn't go out in the paddock across the whole season. But what the government's now done is said you can't average that anymore. And what the farmer must do, regardless of whether they're in the paddock or lying on the couch, has to pay them a minimum 30-hour week. Now, this is something we haven't had to do for temporary workers, whether they be backpackers or Australian workers before. And when we lost our backpackers and the government cancelled the ag visa, effectively we've got a shortage, and now we've got a scheme that was meant to replace it all that now has become unviable for many farmers. Because we're not talking about 1 or 2 workers on each farm. They're talking tens, sometimes hundreds on each of these farms that farmers are having to pay. And if they have to pay for 30 hours a week for someone to lie on the couch and do nothing, then that's not sustainable for not just a farmer, that's not sustainable for any business. And where this common sense provision that we put in place that allowed for the vagaries of weather has been taken away because of an ideology of the union movement and the Labor Party, means that consumers will have to pay more and farmers will either be forced out because they can't afford to do it, and that means that supply will go down, prices will go up, but the ones that will simply have to push that through to the checkout, which every Australian will have to pay. We need 172,000 extra workers in farms and processing sector. The Pacific scheme alone could only brought in 42,000. We're working at 60% capacity at the moment, and this will just drive it further down in terms of supply output.
The other problem here is that large numbers of Pacific Islanders come to Australia to work under this scheme, then ditch the scheme to seek asylum, 1,050 in the past 6 months. And then farmers are left out of pocket because they've had to pay recruitment fees and they're short of workers. That's another problem with this scheme.
It is, and I think I want to take seriously any asylum claim that's made, and should be taken seriously. But when you see such a significant number from such a concentrated area where we haven't seen the civil unrest that we have in other parts of the world, makes me concerned and suspicious that this is more about gaming the system than it is about a genuine asylum. And that's where I think we need to have a good hard look at this. And I think one of the failings that we had is that when we had the Pacific scheme up and going, there were absconders. We should have made examples of those absconders from those employees who paid for their airfares, who paid for their accommodation, who paid for them to be here, and then ran off and went out of the scheme. We should have sent them home and sent a very strong signal to those Pacific nations. This is a two-way contract. There is remittance that's going back into your economy that's more than what most would get back into your economies, but with that comes a responsibility. And now that we're seeing this asylum claim, I'm very sceptical about it. We should take every claim seriously, but when you see such a large scale from such a concentrated area, something's not right in terms of where the government's taking this Pacific scheme.
Indeed. Speaking of cost of living, Anthony Albanese indicated today he'll be looking to roll out more cost of living relief measures in the May budget, which is really helpful for people who expect the cost of living crisis to affect them in May. But most householders need relief now. Why has it taken the Prime Minister so long to realise this is where money should be spent? Not almost $450 million on the Voice referendum, or what they gave $94.5 million to fight climate change in Vietnam. How come the Prime Minister's only now getting it?
Well, you've got to ask the question, where's he been for the last 19 months? He's been the Prime Minister of this country, and the biggest challenge facing our citizens has been the cost of living crisis. And when he wasted $450 million on a referendum that could have gone in to practical measures about building our economy, instead of wasting on a referendum that we told him he'd conflated recognition with another layer of bureaucracy, you got to point to the fact that this Prime Minister is out of touch. He's out of touch with what the common man is saying on the streets. Cost of living is the biggest crisis that Australians are feeling out there, and it's not about pumping more money into the economy. It's actually pulling the right economic levers. And when you look at what's driving inflation at the moment, keeping interest rates higher for longer, it's actually energy and food, and they're intertwined, because not only are they taking away farmers' labour supply and the supply chain's labour supply, but they're also driving up their energy costs. Our energy bills of much of our food processors are 3 to 4 times higher than what they were previously. And when you've got this reckless race to 82% renewables that is tearing up the very thing it's there to protect, the actual native vegetation and the environment, to put all these solar factories and wind factories and transmission lines, 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines. The reason you're paying more and your inflation is staying high is because while your discretionary spending stopped, your fixed hasn't, because the ideology of this government isn't meeting the practical reality of what's coming out of your wallet. And that's why we're saying pull the right economic levers. It's not about flooding money into the economy. It's about making sure that you have all the energy eggs in the basket. That's including nuclear, as well as carbon capture storage. With the renewables we've got at the moment, we shouldn't go any further. In many respects, we're at a saturation point in renewables without any further planning. And so this is where we need to pause, to plan, to get this right on our energy and on our food security. Otherwise, Australians are going to pay more at their checkout and more on their energy bills.
Well, energy retailers have said they're jacking up prices as well, so there'll be more in that. Just before I let you go, you're in Queensland. I know you're a fair bit inland, but on the east coast, especially on the Gold Coast, they've been hit hard by summer storms. The ADF have been called in to help with the clean-up, but there's more storms on the way and heading north towards Brisbane, so things don't look like easing up for Queenslanders, do they?
No, and we copped it up north just before Christmas in North Queensland with Cyclone Jasper and the front that came through after that. Look, we cop it a fair bit in Queensland, but I've got to say we actually do have recovery down pat. I've got to say that much of the damage that's been done to the grid up here is comparable to a cyclone, and we don't see cyclones in southeast Queensland, so it's going to take a little bit more time, but I know the communities come together. Agencies have worked tirelessly to get many of those towns and those houses back up with power, and it just goes to show that not only does state and local governments and federal governments need to prepare for disasters, but we all do. We've all got a responsibility. We just can't rely on the government or those heroes in uniform that come in and help us in our hour of need. We've all got a responsibility to prepare, but I know that we'll get through this, but we're all obviously always being in Queensland looking to the skies just to see what else is coming.
David Littleproud, thanks so much for your time tonight.